Everybody doing okay? All right, so Art Deco is a movement that dates mostly from the 1920s and 1930s. This is completely different from the Beaux-Arts that we just talked about, and in many ways has no similarities, but they just fit well together from a standpoint of having lectures here. And once again, we come to Chicago, and the Art Deco movement doesn't necessarily start in Chicago, but its popularity really springs from the Chicago Tribune Tower competition of 1922. And it's a little bit ironic that it comes out of this competition, as I'll show you in a moment. So in 1922, the Chicago Tribune and Colonel McCormick, they wanted a new building. And he decided it was a publicity stunt, to be quite honest, to promote his newspapers. But he decided to have a design competition to create the most beautiful and distinctive office building in the world. And first prize would be the commission and $50,000, which is a considerable sum of money at that time. And other prize awards, second, third, whatever, would also get some prize money up to, a total prize pot of $100,000, which was a significant amount of money. So this was a big deal, and it was open to anyone around the world. And so people from all over the world, some of the most prominent architects people will be talking about, submitted design entries. More than 260 were received. Some were completely obscure and jokes, and some were really serious architects that become very famous or were already famous on their own. The irony is that the winner was Hood and Howells, who were fairly established architects out of New York, and they won first prize for their Gothic revival design, which the reason the irony is, whether you consider this to be perhaps the most beautiful building in the world or not, the irony is this has nothing to do with Art Deco architecture. So I'll get to how that happens in a moment. This is their entry rendering and a historic view of how it looked before all the other towers along Michigan Avenue were built. You see the Wrigley building on the left. Certainly it is a beautiful building. It was perfectly proportioned and detailed, and the soaring flying buttresses up at the very top are a nice touch. And as even we talked with Reliance Building, the Gothic revival architecture was somewhat fitting for the tall office building because Gothic architecture was meant to be soaring and emphasizing verticality and so forth. But again, this is a revivalist approach to architecture that the Art Deco movement would reject. They kind of took up the cause of the Chicago school architects who wanted an architecture and ornamentation that was of its time and of the 20th century, not of the 13th century France. Here's a view of how it looks today, surrounded by towers. This is actually being converted. No, the Chicago Tribune is no longer headquarters here, and it's being converted into condos now. But what I really want you to know is the second prize. This was submitted by Eliel Saarinen, a Finnish architect who was actually very established in Finland. He had been working in the arts and crafts movement in Finland. He was probably the most successful, well-established architect of Finland, which is not a big country, but still. And he submitted his prize and got second place. And this is a non-historic pastiche. It's a more modern approach, and with these distinctive setbacks, this sort of wedding cake tiered tower without all the frou-frou of wedding cakes. And this, even though it didn't win the first prize, it didn't get built, it was very influential. The Tribune published all of the entries. There were books and publications about it, and a lot of architects around the world saw Saarinen's design and said, we like that one. That's the one he should have picked. And so he got a lot of acclaim and publicity from it, so much that he was able to pack his bags and move to the United States and establish a practice here in the US and brought his son Eero Saarinen. And so in the next few lectures, we're going to be talking quite a bit about both father and son, Eliel and Eero Saarinen. But it also kind of spurs architects, especially for tall buildings, into this Art Deco movement of the 1920s. And I want to show you just a few of the other entries, some good, some bad. This is the entry by D.H. Burnham and Company. This is the successor firm to Daniel Burnham, who had died in 1912, so he wasn't alive during the fair, but some of his design partners carried on the firm and submitted this, which honestly is a little bit awkward in design. Probably a good thing it didn't win. Here is Walter Gropius. He and Adolf Meyer submitted a proposal out of Germany. Gropius we're going to be talking quite a bit about. So he's not actually very famous at this point, certainly not internationally famous, but he's quite talented. And he designs a building that looks like it's, maybe 50 years too soon. This looks like it belongs in the 1950s, not in, the 1920s. And in fact, this architecture would catch up and would become quite popular in 30 so years. And I also want to point out, you can see it really well in the elevations on the right. Notice the windows. Remember, those are Chicago windows. So he, I don't know if in intention or just by coincidence, he picks up this Chicago school reference with his window scheme. Here's a view by another pretty famous German architect, Bruno Taut. Not sure if his entrance was a joke or not. It's pretty odd looking, certainly not very buildable, at least not in the 1920s. The next entry definitely was a joke. This is Adolf Loos, who we will also be talking about out of Vienna, Austria. He kind of picked up on Sullivan's mantra that a tall building ought to be like a column, a classical column, but not designed to look like one, but a base and a shaft and a capital. And so Loos took that literally and created a base, a shaft, and a Doric column capital. This was truly meant to be a joke. I think he understood that the winner was going to be some historical pastiche, and as we will learn in a few lectures' time, Loos was a prominent proponent of a pure modern architecture and did not want historical ornamentation. So he kind of just threw out, well, what if you just make it a Doric column as a joke? And here's another entry by fairly obscure architects out of Holland who create, again, an architectural form that looks like it could have been built in the 1960s or 70s. So a lot of really interesting designs were submitted for this, and it's a famous, amongst architectural scholars, it's still quite famous. So the name Art Deco comes from France, and much of the movement and style was developed in France in the 1920s in this sort of, life-loving era right after World War I, that devastation and the horrors of World War I, which had ended the arts and crafts movement. It killed it off, sort of, to use a pun, with war. And out of this, the vibrancy of the roaring 20s comes a decorative arts movement and an architecture movement that celebrates ornamentation, but an ornament that is more modern and based on not a historical pastiche. Sometimes people called it a style moderne because people recognized how new and modern it would be. And the name itself, Art Deco, is short for Arts Décoratifs, and that came from the Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs in Industrielle Moderne. Really bad French there, but that was held in 1925. The style was already taking root, but that didn't have a name yet tied to it. So this became so popular of modern Art Deco designs that the Art Deco really clicked, especially in the United States, as a name. And there's a number of American examples that I want to show you, starting with Rockefeller Center, perhaps one of the most biggest development. This was built from 1930 to 33. A number of architects and planners were involved because this took up several city blocks. This was a urban design, not just a particular building. Reinhard and Hofmeister were the overall planners. Raymond Hood designed the RCA Building, the most prominent of the towers. And this was, as you'll notice, was built at the very beginning of the Depression. And the Rockefellers had more money than God, and the Depression didn't hurt them all that much. And they kind of felt that they had already started planning this development when the markets crashed. And they felt that it would be a public service to go ahead and build this out, even though they probably knew that many of the offices would be empty for a long time. But it would provide a lot of work and jobs, and was almost an altruistic development, which is rare for developers. So this is a view of the RCA Building at Rockefeller Center, designed by Raymond Hood, and you can see that Art Deco tower aspect, which has a more streamlined view, but you see those step backs that Saarinen had proposed for the Tribune Tower in his competition entry. And there's actually good reasons for these setbacks, actually. As buildings got taller and taller in these dense urban cities like Chicago and New York and others, there was a lot of concern amongst people and amongst planners that these tall buildings would block off all the light and create these dense urban caverns that would have almost no sunlight at ground level. And Chicago actually addressed this initially in the 1890s by saying, well, we'll just limit the building heights and you can't go over 15 stories or something like that. But that wasn't very practical, and the pressure was on to build taller and taller buildings. And so cities like New York and Chicago ultimately created zoning codes that said, well, okay, you can build taller buildings, but the footprint has to get smaller as it gets higher. And this would allow a bit of an angle so that sunlight could shine down and at an angle and hit the ground at different times. And it's kind of a neat view to see this, because you can see the shadow at the ground level created by this building, but you see around it is quite a bit of sunlight hitting the street level. So generally it works pretty well. And that's what causes these distinctive setbacks of Art Deco towers in the 20s and 30s. This is a very famous photograph, Depression-era photograph during the construction of the building. And here's the view. So you've seen this when you see the iconic images of New York on TV, if you watch 30 Rock or something like that. So the famous sculpture out front of the entryway here. And in winter, they have their ice rink out here. They have a big Christmas tree at Christmas time. This is kind of, one might call the sort of Grand Central Plaza of New York, like their front door, or front yard. And a view, this is, like I said, this is an urban planning, so the buildings are low-rise on the sides here, but it's all part of this Rockefeller Center development with the RCA Building towering up above behind there. And some of the ornamentation, as I walked, these are mostly my photographs as I walked around the center a few years ago. And you can see the ornament is not a historical, reflection on classical architecture or Gothic architecture or something like that. It's largely modern. There's sometimes see influences from Native American or sort of Mayan architecture, but for the most part, it's pretty modern stylized. And it also often uses what we call bas relief, which is a very flat sort of sculptural effect. If you see the figures in the central photo, they're not round three-dimensional sculptures. They're rather flat with more incising and limited sculptural elements. Kitty Corner, as part of the complex, is Radio City Music Hall, very famous. And this is designed by Raymond Hood and Edward Durrell Stone, who would also be a very famous architect, Stone. And this is the interior lobby of this. It's a great Art Deco lobby interior. So we start to see with Art Deco, we see rich colors in both marble and in metalwork. We see sort of gold tinted nickel silver metal, or sometimes silver, often aluminum, which was a fairly new metal at the time and quite expensive in the 1920s and 30s. Electricity now is no longer the bare Edison bulbs. You can create these elaborate, bright electrical fixtures. You'll see, this big mural on the wall here. So it's a very ornamented architecture, but in a very modern style, and using and adapting modern materials and so forth. And the main music hall, which I want to show you to compare to that Beaux-Arts auditorium of the Paris Opera House, that richly ornamented space compared to this very modern early 20th century architecture. This is the office, the private apartment sort of for the manager of Radio City Music Hall, and gives you a sense of like a more residential interior. So you see a lot of rich woodwork, not the heavy oak wood that we saw in the arts and crafts movement, but more specialty woods like tiger maple and cherry wood and so forth. And new material called bakelite, which is kind of an early form of a plastic. And again, lots of brushed aluminum and metals. Probably the most famous, right, Art Deco building is going to be the Chrysler Building in New York. This is from 1930, or finished 1930, by William Van Allen, and it's very noticeable because of the spire at the top. The ground floor has the setbacks, or as you rise up the tower, you see these setbacks. The setback becomes a prominent feature once you get to the spire at the very top. Again, all based on these zoning codes. And the top building, this was for the Chrysler Motor Car Company. This was their world headquarters. And it was meant to look a little bit like the hood ornament you might see on an old car like that. Here's a view of it. So anytime you're around New York City, you'll often get these vistas of the Chrysler spire. It's so noticeable. It's hard to miss. And you can see some gargoyles right about the center of the image. These are actual Art Deco gargoyles, and I'll show you what those look like. They're not quite Gothic. They're these eagle elements, and they're pretty famous in photography as well. You can pop out a little trap door there, and sometimes fashion shoots will have a very brave fashion model standing out there like this guy is, and taking photographs with flowing fabrics or something with the cityscape in the background. And a view of the very famous elevator doors. And again, we see the rich marble. We're not just talking about white marble and so forth. Lots of different colors and patterns and veinings in the marbles to sort of highlight the richness of the materials. And the elevator doors are pretty elaborate with inlaid metals and woodwork as well. Chicago has its own examples, maybe the best tower being the Chicago Board of Trade, also from 1930. This is by Holabird and Root. Holabird and Root is the successor firm to Holabird and Roche, who we talked about, one of the great Chicago school firms. So this is actually a son of John Holabird and of John Wellborn Root, who had been in the competing firm of Burnham and Root. They actually partnered together and continued the firm as Holabird and Root. And this building sits dramatically at the terminus of LaSalle Street, so it has a significant site that is quite prominent, and they took advantage of that. They use some of the Beaux-Arts planning aspects. There's a certain symmetry to this, and they use, because of this framework, and the later buildings, the banks on either side frame this so beautifully as well, which are neoclassical, ironically, so the Art Deco tower really stands out architecturally. And then it's famous for the setback tower, which, as you see, has at least minor setbacks even as you go taller and taller and taller till you get the pyramidal roof and then the statue of Ceres at the very top. Ceres was the Roman goddess of grain and the harvest, and so the sculptor was asked to put reproduction of her up at the very top of the building. And this at one point was the tallest spot in Chicago. There were not, this was the tallest building, and if you stood on the platform at the base of Ceres feet, you were as tall as anything in the city of Chicago. And I've actually stood on the base of Ceres feet, and I was going to take a picture of myself up there, and my camera battery had died on me, so I have no picture of me standing right at Ceres. Here's a detail of the clock ornament closer to the base of the building. So on the right is a Native American with corn, famous to the Americas, and on the left is a Mesopotamian with grain, which was where grain, first harvested, and an eagle in the middle. So it's picking up again, elements related to, trade of commodities, but in this very modern Deco styling. And the entry is quite elaborate. You can walk in the lobby. Much of the building is closed off to the public without, clearance to go in. But you can walk through the lobby again when everything opens up again. So I urge you to do that sometime. Beautiful Art Deco space that I worked on the restoration of, actually, with this beautiful, polished marble. And the light fixtures, like I said, we're not talking bare Edison bulbs again. These are nickel silver framed light fixtures that are in a Art Deco style that we recreated during the restoration. And the main lobby space is this soaring 3-level space that is really exquisite, lined in this polished black marble with nickel silver, sort of gold colored nickel silver metals, and then this incredible light fixture that goes up the wall and all the way across the ceiling and back down the opposite wall. It's one of the most incredible light fixtures in the city. And to end, I want to circle back around to Chicago and the Century of Progress. We started Beaux-Arts with the 1893 World's Fair. We're going to end with Art Deco with the Century of Progress in Chicago from 1933. And this was held to celebrate 100 years of the founding of Chicago from 1833. And it was held right in the heart of the Depression, and this was really partly a way to try to, give people jobs and give them something to do during the height and the, despair of the Depression. And unlike, 1893, we're in a completely different architectural era, so the fair largely is this Art Deco and even a variant that we call moderne architecture. There's also a link here that I've put up on the YouTube page, which is a Technicolor 10-15 minute overview of the fair, so you can see in color from the 1930s what the fair kind of looked like. So it's fun to see that. This is a map. This was held along the lakefront, but up closer, just into the South Loop area. In fact, Northerly Island was built to create the fair. This is where Soldier Field is, which had been built in the 20s. And later Mix Field would be here, and then of course that was taken out by Mayor Daley. So it had a beautiful lakefront setting as well. Here's a historic aerial photograph taken from the Loop location. There you can see the Field Museum in the foreground and Northerly Island with the lagoon. There was no Ferris wheel. This time they built 2 giant towers on either side of the lagoon, and you could take rocket ships that sailed across from tower to tower. They literally called them rocket ships, which I guess was play on this new rocket technology. Here's some of the buildings. This is the administration building. So very Art Deco architecture. Again, a certain bit of symmetry that we saw with the Beaux-Arts, but in a very modern form. The Science Hall. Some of these are, of course, they had a lot of color postcards and photographs at that time they could do. Chrysler Motors had a major facility on display here. Not to be outdone was General Motors, who had their own facility with a kind of modern tower element. The Burlington Zephyr, which you can still visit at the Museum of Science and Industry. This was the first streamlined train, and they would pull up and you could take a tour of this streamlined railroad train, which was the most, modern form of transportation at the time. And there were different examples of housing too, the most famous being the House of Tomorrow by George and Fred Keck. This was a house that showed what a modern house might be. It had air conditioning, it had a garage for your car, it had a garage for your airplane, because they figured airplanes would be the wave of transportation in the future. Big, huge plate glass windows, which made the air conditioning quite necessary. And inside were all the modern amenities of electricity and appliances for housewives you could ever imagine or want. This, fortunately, the house was saved and was moved to northern Indiana and Beverly Shores, but it's kind of undergone this long restoration process that has not been very successful so far. Here's an image of the interior. So you would tour this. It would be staged like you might, a realtor might almost, with these modern furnitures and lighting and appliances and so forth. There was also the Frigidaire House, which was also air conditioned, and a promotion by Frigidaire Company to show off, wow, wouldn't it be cool if houses could have air conditioning, and a very modern sort of stucco clad architecture there as well. So it was trying to show off a number of things that are going to become actually quite popular, other than the having your own airplane hangar in your house. Most of these other things would take off and become major components of housing and buildings in the 20th century. So that leaves us to the end of Art Deco.